5. Jungian wholeness. Another theory about how to liberate women to greater strength is called wholeness. This philosophy is hard to define and survey because it is both relatively new and fertile with insights and combinations. Let me begin by simply defining wholeness theory as it will be used in this chapter. Wholeness is a goal of personality growth by which the feminine and masculine components are integrated in both women and men. Wholeness springs from the perception developed primarily in Jungian psychology that many people are one-sided in some respects, including the masculine or feminine. A man might have too much masculine and too little feminine. A woman might have too much feminine and too little masculine. But also a man might have too much feminine or a woman too much masculine. Psychic wholeness comes when such imbalances begin to be rectified by coming into touch with the deeply hidden and undeveloped parts of the self. The discussion of feminine and masculine in Jungian psychology includes two terms which are still vague and confusing to the uninitiated: the anima and the animus. These words are not, as some imagine, simply synonyms for feminine and masculine. No, they are more subtle. They are archetypes, inherited modes of psychic functioning that parallel certain instincts in animals. Anima is the feminine part of a man's nature, unconscious to him, and usually projected. Animus is the masculine part of a woman's nature. In other words, every man has an archetypal image of the feminine, a highly emotionally charged fantasy symbol. This feminine principle is really inside him, but he projects it onto real women as he tries to find the ideal in the real. In the same way, every woman has an archetypal image of the masculine. This masculine principle is within her, but is projected onto the men she meets as she seeks the ideal in the real. Projection ultimately fails, for real men and women can't satisfy our desire for the perfection of the ideal. However, all is not lost. When during therapy or self-analysis a man or woman realizes the extent of his or her yearning for the feminine or masculine, he or she may begin to search for it within the self. So, for example, if I find myself passionately in love with a man because of his obvious strength, and then become disillusioned when I discover his clay feet, instead of turning against the man in bitterness because he failed to be an adequate leading post, I can seek the masculine strength I need within my own self. Or a man enchanted with a delicate, tender woman may feel cheated to discover that she is not a flower, but a live human being capable even of perspiration. Instead of punishing her for failing to live up to his image, he can seek the delicate, tender emotions buried within his own psyche, for example, by writing poetry or tending a garden. How do these ideas about projection of the masculine and feminine relate to wholeness theory? When I begin to be aware of my hidden masculine and feminine qualities, I can try to become whole or integrated by getting in touch with these parts. The whole man will then live out his masculine and feminine traits. The whole woman will be comfortable with living out her feminine and masculine traits. To make this idea more vivid, think of women and men you admire. Do not most of them have this kind of wholeness? Christian Jungians advise us not to meditate on the way that Jesus manifested all the masculine and feminine traits, Was Joan of Arc not passionately responsive and yet also courageous to the death? Let us see what a Jungian analyst might think of the process of weak women seeking the roots of freedom through greater strength. M. Esther Harding writes the following. Western civilization lays special emphasis on the value of the outer, and this fits in more nearly with man's nature than with woman's. The feminine spirit is more subjective, more concerned with feelings and relationships than with laws and principles of the outer world. And so it happens that the conflict between outer and inner is usually more devastating for women than for men. That's Harding, 1971, page 11. According to Harding, there is a great conflict in women between the masculine side they must develop to work in the world and their more ancient feminine nature. For women of our times, a one-sided life is not sufficient. The conflict between the opposing tendencies of masculine and feminine within them must be faced. They cannot resume the feminine values in the old instinctive and unconscious way. Harding also thinks that modern women are more schooled in the masculine than the feminine, and that they will be stronger by relating to their feminine side. In an interesting chapter in Woman's Mysteries, Harding develops the idea of the virgin goddess as a symbol of a feminine way of being liberated. The virgin goddesses in various religions are not dependent on a human male, but achieve fulfillment by being ravished by their god. Meditation on virgin goddesses can lead women to understand the way in which sacrifices of the ego's desires can be freeing and renewing when our passions are given back to the God to whom we belong. Through the transformation of passion in response to the divine, women can gain sexual control without the unsatisfactory effects of repression. Out of such unconventional sublimation of sexual drives comes the maternal feeling women desire so keenly to experience with a universal scope. In other words, we can't just repress the negative feminine, for then it will always come back in haunting fantasies or destructive outbreaks. Instead, we must relate to the divine in complete passion and let the divine fertilize us, bringing forth positive feminine traits. Harding points to an archetype of goddesses who have to sacrifice their sons to help women with the problem of possessiveness. Today, women who ponder such symbols will come to understand the primordial meaning of the necessary process of letting go. A woman healed and integrated through the divine can inspire men without trying to conquer them. If she is married, her inner virginity will express itself in her independence of convention and ratification by others. She will be a free spirit, or in Jung's terms, an individual who is at home in herself. Harding's ideas are evocative, but I certainly don't think women should meditate on goddesses. We should ponder instead the fascinating and inspiring archetypes of positive feminine traits in Mary and the women saints. Receiving Woman, a book by Anne Belford Ulanoff, 1981, another Jungian therapist and professor of psychiatry and religion at Union Theological Seminary, can further aid our understanding of the ideal of wholeness and feminine strength. Reacting against the stereotyping of the past and of present-day movements, Ulanoff tries to help each woman see herself as an individual with a wide range of possibilities as she combines the masculine and feminine parts of herself. Quote, many women are beginning to understand that they can no more be determined in their inmost selves by the old benevolent patriarchy than by the new malevolent sexism. New stereotypes are no less coercive than old ones. No great distance exists between all real women marry and bear children and all real women know that men are sexist and rapists at heart. In both, woman is a passive victim determined by forces outside herself that she may resist, but is all but helpless to change. Wholeness, 1981, page 17. Unlike Jung, Wholeness objects to the idea that woman experiences her unconscious as masculine in the obverse of the way man finds his unconscious to be feminine. Instead, she feels that our concept of the feminine has to expand to include all of what women really are, including intellect, drive, and power. The idea that women become strong not by trying to be more masculine, but by allowing their own individual freedom and courage to come forth is become more and more prevalent among psychologists. After all, gentleness is different in a man than in a woman, precisely because it is a powerful man who is being gentle. In the same way, strength in a woman is different precisely because it may overcome passivity. In The Woman in the Tower by Betsy Caprio, 1983, a spiritual director and parish minister, women are taught to experiment with possibilities of greater wholeness by getting in touch with the four elements, symbols of Jungian personality types. Air equals thinking, earth equals sensory, fire equals intuition, water equals feeling. Caprio resolves a problem regarding the feminine and masculine I have often puzzled over in my study of wholeness theory. If women develop the masculine and men the feminine, why wouldn't their personalities end up being alike? Then it would make no difference whether one was with a woman or a man except biologically. Betsy Caprio theorizes, on the contrary, that for a woman to be whole, she must develop her feminine side first. The masculine in her must take the form of inner strength and not become an aggressive thrust in the world. Likewise, for men, the masculine must be developed first, with the feminine flourishing within rather than an outward form of exaggerated feminine traits. To translate Caprio's image into the categories of this book, the woman would have a strong positive feminine bolstered by an inner positive masculine, and the man would have a strong positive masculine with a beautiful inner positive feminine. If the woman tries to develop the masculine first, she is all too likely to fall into the negative masculine. If the man tries to develop the feminine first, he may slip into the negative feminine. Jungians also speak of women having different personality types, each with its own strength. The girlish woman is spontaneous and charming. The interior woman has the strength of wisdom. The motherly woman is enduring. The strong, assertive woman can carry out projects in the world at large. One can gain in wholeness by developing areas of the feminine previously neglected. Strengths of wholeness theory. I'm just taking a tiny moment's break, Sebastian, which you have to just take away, just to turn off the AC, which is too cold. So back to strengths of wholeness theory. The truths of wholeness theory seem to jump out at me when I meet an individual who demonstrates a remarkable lack of wholeness. For instance, an extremely negative masculine man who is cold, domineering, and overly critical, or an extraordinarily negative feminine woman who is weak, passive, and silly. And so I consider one of the main strengths of wholeness theory the attempt to liberate people from such crippling one-sidedness. Another benefit of wholeness theory is that the reverence its proponents exhibit for the processes going on in the deeper parts of others as well as oneself. Most women are one-sidedly feminine at times. This can severely limit their freedom to bring about the good. In some circumstances, feminine warmth, charm, and intuition need the balance of a daring attitude, leadership, and the objectivity that comes from analysis. The word process has become something of a cliche in popular psychology along with its correlative growth. Yet we owe a great deal to the figures who have developed such concepts. A Christian button worn in the 70s read, "Please don't judge me. God isn't finished with me yet." The belief that others and oneself are not fixed in unsatisfactory patterns, but instead might be in a state of hibernation pending a new spring, helps bring forth new energies. In a Charles Williams novel, a sage advises his neophyte that it is a sin to give up on another person, to make a picture of him at his worst moment and then believe that to be the final portrait. Julie Lesh Wiley, columnist for the National Catholic Register, often warns against hard-boiling people in their sins. Sister Mary Neal, a Dominican theologian who is well-versed in wholeness theory, gives many self-exploration workshops. She uses common images to jostle the psyche out of its rut-like resignation to stagnant patterns. Questions such as, when have you most needed a refuge? And when have you been a refuge for others? Gently lead participants into openness to positive feminine and masculine traits. Sister Neal sometimes speaks of those whose personalities seem consolidated around negative characteristics as not having done their emotional homework. In other words, we should not think that we can become assertive women just by an exercise of willpower, but neither should we sink into passivity about our shortcomings. Reverence for our struggles to achieve wholeness leads us to appreciate the individual instead of insisting on conformity. Proposals for flexible options in society can be offered in a warm, concerned way rather than in the strident, protesting spirit sometimes displayed by feminists who push the same programs. Weaknesses of wholeness theory. The weaknesses of wholeness theory become apparent when wholeness is considered the sole goal of life. When its insights are instead part of a wider philosophy, especially a Christian perspective, defects of this psychological school can, for the most part, be overcome. The problems I see in wholeness theory include these: insufficient distinction between positive and negative traits, idolization of process and of the individual, vagueness about critical ethical norms. Some proponents of wholeness theory will refer to certain traits as demonic, but often the interest in overcoming repression takes the form of a fascination with the feminine and masculine, without distinguishing between the positive and negative traits of each. A therapeutic perspective can influence an individual's philosophy in a way that may confuse rather than clarify the issues. Since the unexpressed parts of the personality can explode destructively, therapists may advise clients to experiment with their hidden masculine or feminine. The result can be worse than the original, less dynamic but less harmful state of being. For example, a masculinized woman may start manifesting her negative feminine by seducing happily married men. A quiet, passive man may become viciously violent as he explores his repressed masculine. M. Esther Harding reveals some of this problem. On the one hand, she seems to praise the irrational, and on the other, she warns against it. Mystical symbols of the feminine and masculine speak to us with enormous power. Their strange, non-rational logic will carry its own conviction, and no rational proof of their truth will be necessary, Harding, 1971. Yet, in Harding's chapter on the Virgin Goddess, she warns against displacing conventionality with egocentricity when letting loose in the sensual realm. Genuine love must be safeguarded as a prime value. It's easy to see how the lack of a clear distinction between negative and positive traits can lead to vagueness about ethical norms and the commitments involved. It is not uncommon to hear women involved in the imagery of wholeness justify experimental sexual activity, contraception, abortion, divorce, or leaving their children by saying that they are just not ready for the full commitment required to be a wife or a mother. But such decisions deeply wound the feminine. Homosexuality as a lifestyle as well as an orientation is sometimes also justified as an opportunity to explore the feminine or masculine side of a personality. Some books on healing of homosexuality by Nicolosi and Harvey, though mainly about male homosexuality, can be helpful for lesbian-oriented women. See references at the end of this book. Such ambiguity or deviance from Christian moral norms, even among religious people immersed in wholeness theory, reflects a tendency to make the individual and his processes into a sort of absolute or idol, for which others may have to be sacrificed. For instance, Jungian analyst Anne Ulanoff in Receiving Woman describes new ways that women are seeking themselves. She writes, "A woman in her 50s leaves her marriage of many years because she knows it to have been a pretense that damaged both parties and their children. She is not at all certain who she is or where she belongs. By seizing the outer truth, she hopes to find her way to the inner one. Though criticized for her ex-husband as selfish in her action of divorce, she believes she gives a gift to him and to their children. An example, even if confused and groping, of trying to live out who one truly is. She finds this less painful and more life-giving than persisting in a false identity." Ulanoff, 1981, page 28. A more drastic example is given in Doris Lessing's Children of Violence, 1970. A girl brought up in a puritanical household becomes wild in her teens. Then she seeks security in a conventional marriage, but she finds being a mother to be stifling, in spite of the ample help of servants and other luxuries of her middle-class South African life. While her daughter is still a young child, she abruptly abandons her home to seek fulfillment through immersion in communist activities. Returning to Anne Ulanoff's example, she does not claim that divorce is good in itself. This would not be the way a wholeness theorist would express herself. Instead, she leaves out the moral question entirely and makes the individual's exploration of the destiny of self more important. Giving such absolute value to the individual often accompanies a tendency to view the divine not as a trinity of really existing persons, but rather as images that symbolize the nameless transcendent. Harding writes of the virginity of Mary as one of a number of instances of virgin goddess symbols. The factual validity of this doctrine is not proposed, but rather is left vague. Yet I maintain that such a lack of clarity about the objectivity of divine persons actually militates against the complete feminine experience that Jungians are so eager to foster. Trustful, peaceful surrender to the divine persons depends upon faith. Otherwise, a certain non-directional inwardness in prayer and meditation contributes to negative feminine self-absorption. A similar problem can arise in close relationships between women and men because of the idolization of the process. In a subtle manner, people can view members of the opposite sex not as unique, lovable personalities in themselves, but as stepping stones, as the means to fostering an individual's psychological processes. Quote, "He brings out the feminine in me, that's why I love him," unquote. Another quote, "She brings out the masculine in me, that's why I love her." The language of projection can make it appear that the beloved has no independent qualities whatsoever. You are projecting your inner masculine on that man. Is he just a blank screen ready to be projected on? Of course not, but the lack of a full metaphysics of the precious goodness of the person can impede the woman's grateful response to the real qualities of the other, depriving her of one part of the positive feminine experience of affirmation. Others question whether targeting feminine or masculine qualities such as nurturing or freedom is the way to acquire them. Participating in many different kinds of human potential workshops can create the conclusion that one can arrive at wholeness through persistent experimentation and introspection. But desired traits often arise more naturally through our responding to the challenges of life by focusing outside ourselves. For example, a woman who has never heard of methods for bringing out her femininity may realize it simply by carrying a baby to term. Her tender, empathetic characteristics will emerge in response to the baby rather than as a result of artificial methods. Similarly, a man or woman may develop leadership traits by accepting new responsibilities rather than by joining consciousness-raising groups. The wholeness model fosters a somewhat misleading image of the strong woman who seeks her own salvation by means of a series of courageous interior adventures. This risk-taking sounds wonderful, particularly in contrast to the mindless way many of us are formed by a value-anemic culture. What is left out, however, is our ultimate vulnerable dependency on God and other loving persons for the discovery of the deepest meaning of our lives. How faith in God fulfills the dream of feminine and free will be the subject of the final section.